Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Richard Stubbs, Chief Executive of Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber, and also the Chair of the National Health Innovation Network. Welcome to this session. ConfedExpo, as I'm sure you've seen over the last 2 days, aims to drive change in health and care. And technology is critical in delivering that change. But what does that mean for the future of our healthcare profession, and how can technology help to solve the long-standing problems that we face? I'm incredibly delighted to introduce this keynote address from Dr. Daniel Susskind. Daniel, as I'm sure you know, is a senior research associate at the Institute for Ethics in AI at Oxford University. He's also a research professor in economics at King's College London. He's the author of the co-author of the best-selling book, The Future of the Professions, and the author of A World Without Work, which was described by the New York Times as required reading for any potential presidential candidate thinking about the economy of the future. So let's hope they are reading it. His new book, Growth, A Reckoning, was published in April. We'll be hearing from Daniel in just a few seconds, but if you'd like to pose any questions to him, please do get involved via the Slido facility on the ConfedExpo app, and I'll do my best to get as many questions to Daniel once we've heard from him. But could you all join me, please, in welcoming Daniel to the stage?
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you. Vanguards, who are to a group of people and institutions who are using technology to solve the sorts of problems that traditionally only very particular types of professionals have solved, but increasingly they're doing it in quite different ways. I then want to share a few of the trends, a few of the patterns that are taking place across the professions. Everything I'm about to say is driven by technology, and I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about one technology in particular, which is artificial intelligence. It's something that has, of course, captured people's imaginations in the last couple of years, and I think there's been some hype, and I think there's been some overexcitement, but nevertheless, beneath that, I think something quite interesting has happened. And I want to spend a bit of time thinking about what exactly it is that's happened in the world of AI, and why it matters so much for thinking about the future of the healthcare profession. I then want to turn to look at what this means for the work that healthcare professionals will do in the future. And finally, I want to close with some more practical thoughts, what you should actually do in response to these ideas that I'm about to share. So that's the plan, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so for a conversation for me to take some questions as well. So I look forward to hearing some reflections and questions too. So let's dive in. And as I said, very broadly, I think there are two futures for the professions and for the healthcare profession, both of which rest upon technology. Now, the first future, I think, is a reassuringly familiar one. It's just a more efficient version of what we have today. And here, professionals of all different stripes use technology, but essentially just to streamline and to optimize the traditional ways in which they've worked. And, this is the profession, so, ways they've worked since the middle of the 19th century. And as you look across the professions, there's lots of examples of this at work. It's, doctors seeing patients via Skype. It's architects using computer-assisted design software. It's teachers using online material in the classrooms. But there's also a second future. And this, I think, is a very different proposition. And here, technology doesn't just streamline and optimize the traditional ways in which professionals have worked, but it actively displaces professionals from their work. And in my work, what I call increasingly capable systems and machines, and I'll say more on what I mean by that in a moment, but these systems and machines either operated alone or, and I think this is quite important for everyone gathered here this afternoon, just designed and operated by people that don't look a lot like traditional professionals. They gradually take on more and more of the tasks and the activities that in the past we might have associated with traditional professionals. And the argument that I make in my work and that I want to make today is that for now and in the medium term, we'll see these two futures developing in parallel. as we do today, we'll see examples of both of them at work. But I think in the longer run, that second future is going to dominate. That through technology, we're going to find new, more efficient, more effective ways of solving, again, the sorts of problems that in the past, only very particular types of professionals have solved. And I think this is a fundamental challenge to the traditional professions, and I include the healthcare profession in that. And so that is where the thinking and the evidence leads me. But it also leads me to ask a more fundamental question. And I want to begin with this afternoon, which is, why do we have the professions at all? Why do we have doctors, nurses, teachers, accountants, architects, consultants, and so on? And the answer to that question is that although from a distance, all these professions look quite different, actually in analogous ways, they're all a solution to the same fundamental problem. And the problem is this, which is that, to put it bluntly, nobody knows everything. Human beings have what Herbert Hart, the great legal philosopher, called limited understanding of the world around them. And so we turn to professionals of all different stripes because they help us solve these daily challenges that we face in life that we can't necessarily solve by ourselves. So in what I call a print-based industrial society, the professions are the way that we solve these daily challenges. They've got the knowledge, the experience, the know-how, the wisdom, and my term for all of these things is they have this practical expertise. They've got this practical ability to solve all those difficult problems that those they help do not. They operate under a grand bargain, and it's an arrangement that differs across professions and differs across jurisdictions, but essentially it's an arrangement that entitles the professions, often to the exclusion of others, to provide certain types of services. And in turn, the professions are entrusted to act as gatekeepers, each profession responsible for its own unique body of knowledge. Doctors look after medical knowledge, lawyers look after legal knowledge, accountants look after accounting knowledge, and so on. And so this is my analysis of why we have the professions in this print-based industrial society. But the key point for us all gathered here this afternoon is we're no longer in a print-based industrial society. We're in what I call a technology-based internet society, and if we are frank with one another, our traditional professions, including our healthcare profession, is creaking. You know, it's unaffordable in that most people, most institutions simply do not have access to the expertise of first-rate professionals, or indeed, in many cases, any professionals. You know, the professions are antiquated. By and large, they rely upon pretty old-fashioned ways of producing and sharing knowledge and information, despite in many cases, the existence of feasible alternatives. They're opaque. And, you know, sometimes this is because the work that the professions do is genuinely too complicated for ordinary people to understand. But other times, you know, take a walk through a British courtroom just down the road and have a look at the oak paneling and the horsehair wigs. You get the sense that there's some intentional mystification at work in the professions too. And finally, the professions underperform. And I mean something very particular by this. Given the way we organize expertise in society, in the heads of our professionals, buried away in their filing cabinets, the very finest practical expertise, it's an incredibly scarce resource. Only a very privileged and a very lucky few people have access to it. And so I ask the question, and this is the question I want us all to be asking this afternoon, as we move from a print-based society to an internet society, might there be new ways of organizing professional work? Might there be new ways of solving the sorts of problems that, again, in the past, only very particular types of professionals have solved? Do we necessarily need all those traditional gatekeepers? Now, to answer that question, we've got to go to the vanguard, as I said, to the people and institutions who are using technology to solve all these long-standing problems, often in very different ways. In my work, there's hundreds of case studies of interesting disruption taking place in the world of the professions. I've just picked out a few examples just to give you a flavor of what I think it is that we've all got to be trying to make sense of and prepare for at the moment. So in education, for instance, more people signed up for Harvard's online courses in a single year than had attended the actual university in its entire existence up until that year. Closer to home, in the world of medicine, a team of researchers at Stanford recently announced the development of a system that if you give it a photo of a freckle, it will tell you as accurately as the finest dermatologists in the world whether or not that freckle is cancerous. And in the same vein, DeepMind, the artificial intelligence company based in London, now owned by Google, recently announced the development of a system that can diagnose up to 50 different eye problems as accurately as leading ophthalmologists. In the world of journalism, if you go onto a website like Bloomberg.com today for your financial news, about a third of the content that you read on there, a third, is generated by an automated system rather than written by a traditional human journalist. In the legal world, on eBay, every single year, 60 million disputes arise. 60 million. And they're resolved online without any traditional lawyers using what's known as an e-mediation platform. So just to put that 60 million in context, that is 40 times the number of civil claims that are filed in the entire English and Welsh justice system. It's 3 times the number of lawsuits filed in the entire US legal system. They're resolved on this one website every year, no traditional lawyers. Again, in the legal world, Lex Machina, a system that's said to be able to predict the outcome of patent disputes as accurately as leading patent lawyers. In the world of architecture, the new concert hall in Hamburg, a really beautiful space. You know, the kind of space you look at and think, gosh, only a human being with a remarkably refined aesthetic sensibility, with a great sense of style and taste, would be capable of crafting a space like this. Only this space was not designed by a human being. It was designed algorithmically. Now, the technology that has really captured people's imaginations in the last few months in particular has, of course, been GPT. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment when I come to set out some thoughts on artificial intelligence. But just let me make one observation about this now. What I think people have found particularly interesting and particularly troubling to some extent about this technology is the breadth, the generality of its capabilities. All of those systems I just mentioned were very good at very specific tasks, making a medical diagnosis, designing a beautiful building. What's so interesting about GPT, of course, is, again, the generality and the breadth of its capability. It's as comfortable crafting a legal argument as it is writing a piece of poetry. And it's that breadth, that generality that I think has been particularly interesting for those who follow these technologies. Now, one of the professions I'm quite interested in, I mean, quite literally the profession of white-collar work, is the profession of divinity. And this is the most playful, but also the most provocative of the case studies that I want to share. In 2011, the Catholic Church issued the first ever digital imprimatur. Now, for those of you who don't know, of course, the imprimatur is the official license granted by the Catholic Church to religious texts. And it granted it to this app called Confession that helps you prepare for confession. So I kid you not, although you can't see it on your screen, it has tools to help you track your sin. And there's even a really helpful drop-down panel with various options for contrition to choose from as well. And I should say, it caused a tremendous stir at the time. It was so controversial, in fact, that the Vatican itself felt it had to step forward and say, look, while you're allowed to use this app to prepare for confession, please remember that it isn't actually a substitute for the real thing, which always made me smile. Now, the challenge when we are confronted with all of these cases, and it seems like every day we hear stories of systems and machines taking on tasks and activities in the world of white-collar work and professional work, is to try and draw out the trends and the patterns that are taking place beneath the surface. And in the book that was mentioned before, The Future of the Professions, that's what I do. And we identify 8 high-level patterns, underneath them 30 more granular trends. I've just picked out 3 that I think will be of particular interest for thinking about the healthcare profession. The first is, and you see this across the professions, a move away from bespoke service. Many professionals have traditionally thought of their work as a kind of craft, a sort of bespoke activity, like a tailor crafting a suit to the particular contours of their client, or an artist starting each project afresh from a blank sheet of paper. We're seeing across the professions a move away from that, a recognition that actually a lot of professional work doesn't need to be handled in this handicraft, bespoke way. We're also seeing the increasing decomposition of professional work. Again, many professionals have traditionally thought of their work as a sort of monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff that has to be handled by people like them working in the sorts of institutions that they work in. And again, increasingly we see professional work being broken down into all the different tasks and activities that make it up, and it transpiring that actually many of those tasks and activities can either be done by very different types of people, or in many cases don't require people at all. And this is, of course, the third trend, a trend towards the routinization of professional work. A recognition that when we break professional work down in that way, even some of our most expert roles, quite a lot of it can turn out to be routine, relatively process-based, and can be automated accordingly. And I'll come back to these trends in different ways in a moment. But I want to spend now just a little bit of time thinking about artificial intelligence, because really this is the thing that has captured people's imaginations in the last year or two, and I think there has been some overexcitement about it. But nevertheless, I think beneath it, something interesting has happened. And I want to try and explain what it is that's happened and why it matters in particular for thinking about the future of the healthcare profession. And the story I want to tell about artificial intelligence begins in what I call the first wave of artificial intelligence. And this first wave takes place back in the 1980s. And the 1980s are the time when my dad, my co-author in writing that first book, The Future of the Professions, was doing his doctorate in artificial intelligence and the law at Oxford University. So almost 40 years ago, he was already trying to build systems that could solve legal problems. And something quite interesting happened in 1986 in the UK, which was that a very difficult piece of law was passed called the Latent Damage Act. And it turned out that the leading expert in the world at the time on this very particular piece of law was a man called Philip Capper. And Philip happened to be the dean of the law school at Oxford where my dad was doing his doctorate. And Philip came to my dad and said, look, this is completely absurd. Anytime anyone wants to understand if this law applies to them, they have to come to me. And so what he said was, look, why don't we work together, join forces, and build a system based on my expertise that people could use instead of having to come to me. And that's exactly what they did from 1986 to 1988. They worked on the development of the world's first commercially available AI system in the law. Now, this was the home screen design for the system they built. My dad assures me this was, in fact, a cool screen design back in the 1980s. Never been entirely convinced by that. Just to give you a flavor of what they were up against, though, here's an extract from the law. Section 2 of this act shall not apply to an action to which this section applies. Okay? That's a more readily understandable piece of the legislation. I love this, though. They published it in the form of floppy disks at a time when floppy disks genuinely were still floppy. And essentially what they did together was they built a gigantic decision tree where you answered these yes or no questions, and you navigated through a tree by answering these sorts of questions that had quite literally millions of branches through it, that my dad and his colleagues had manually, painstakingly crafted together, buried away in that computer science laboratory. But the key point for us is they weren't just doing this in law, they were doing it in medicine and also in tax and audit and consulting. But in all these different domains, the general approach in that first wave of artificial intelligence was always the same. People thought that if you wanted to build a system to outperform a human expert, you had to sit down with a human expert. You had to get that human expert to explain to you how they solved whatever problem it was you were trying to automate, and then you had to try and somehow capture that human explanation in a set of instructions or a set of rules for one of those systems to follow, one of those gigantic decision trees. Now, what's quite interesting is that back in the 1980s, they thought that by now these sorts of systems would be widespread, that we would see them everywhere. And, we do see some examples of them today, but as many of you will know, as the 1980s came to an end and as the 1990s began, research, interest, funding, essentially progress in artificial intelligence dried up. And a period known as the AI winter began, when really not a lot of progress happened in the field at all. But the great turning point comes in 1997. And it's a moment I hope lots of you are familiar with. It was when Garry Kasparov, who at the time was the world chess champion, was beaten by a computer system owned by IBM called Deep Blue. And it was an amazing achievement. But what's so interesting about this is that if you had gone back to the 1980s and said to my dad and his colleagues, do you think something like this will ever be possible? And remember, they were some of the most open-minded, some of the most progressive, some of the most ambitious people thinking about AI back then. If you had said to them, do you think something like this will ever be possible? They would have said to you emphatically, no, we'll never do it. And the reason why they would have said no is very important. And it's very important, again, for thinking about what's happening now and why it matters for the future of healthcare. The reason they would have said no was because, again, at the time, they were of that first wave mindset. They thought the only way to build a system to outperform a human being is to sit down with a human being, get them to explain to you how they solve whatever problem it is you're trying to automate, and then try and capture that human explanation in a set of instructions or rules for one of these systems to follow, one of those big decision trees. But here's the problem, or at least what they thought was the problem, and Garry Kasparov is a really good example of this problem. If you sit down with Garry Kasparov and say, Garry, tell me how it is you're so good at chess. How do you do it? He might begin by giving you a few clever opening moves or closing plays, and chess fans in the room will know that that's what he does in his various YouTube tutorials and so on. But in the end, he'd struggle. He'd say things like, it requires judgment, creativity, instinct, intuition, experience. In short, he would say to you, I cannot articulate exactly how it is that I'm so good at chess. And that was why my dad and his colleagues thought something like this just could never be automated. If a human being cannot explain how they perform a task, well, where on earth do we begin? They worried in writing this set of instructions for a machine to follow. Now, what they hadn't banked on, the mistake that they made, and I think it's an understandable one back in the 1980s, was not to anticipate the technological progress that would take place in the decades to come. In particular, the extraordinary increase in processing power that would happen in the coming years. So this is one way to see exactly what happened to computational power. I'm using index of computations per second here as a measure, basically, of processing power. What you can see is not a lot happening from 1850 to 1950, relatively flat. And then beginning in 1950, you get what looks like a relatively linear increase in computational power. Only, of course, this is not a linear increase in computational power. Mathematicians in the room will note that the y-axis there is a logarithmic axis. So each step up on that axis is a 10-fold increase in computational power. 2 steps, 100-fold. 3 steps, 1,000-fold. 4 steps, 10,000-fold. So what you're looking at there is an explosion in processing power. And this is what my dad and his colleagues just didn't anticipate. So by the time Garry Kasparov actually sat down with Deep Blue, and remember, this was more than 25 years ago, Deep Blue was already calculating up to 330 million moves a second. Garry Kasparov, at best, could juggle 110 moves in his head on any one turn. He was blown out the water by brute force processing power and a huge amount of data storage capability. It didn't matter, and this is the key point, it did not matter that Garry Kasparov couldn't articulate how he was so good at chess. It didn't matter. The system was able to perform the task in a fundamentally different way. Now, when we were doing the research for that first book, we had a correspondence with a man called Patrick Winston, who was one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. And he put it to us like this. He said, there's lots of ways of being smart that aren't smart like us. And I think this is a big challenge to many traditional professionals. And I include the healthcare profession in this. Because often they tend to think the opposite. They tend to think the only way to be smart is to be smart like them. And that leads, I think, to one of the most important ideas in my work and one of the most important ideas I want to share with you this afternoon. And it's what I call the artificial intelligence fallacy. And you see this not just in popular commentary on the future of work, but also in far more expert analysis too. And the fallacy is this. It's the mistaken assumption that the only way to develop systems that perform tasks at the level of human beings or higher is to somehow copy or imitate or replicate the way that human beings perform that task. Now, that might have been true 40 years ago in that first wave of artificial intelligence, but it's simply no longer the case. So let me give you some practical examples a bit closer to home. Look, Daniel, you don't understand. What professionals do in the healthcare profession requires judgment. And judgment is the sort of thing a machine can never do. And I say to you the question, can a machine ever exercise judgment? It's the wrong question to be asking in light of the technological developments that I've just described. In fact, there are two more important questions we should be asking. And the first is this: to what problem is judgment the solution? Why do people go to professionals, be it a doctor, a nurse, a lawyer, whoever it might be, and say, look, I need your judgment. Give me your judgment. And the answer to that question, it seems to me, is because of uncertainty. You know, when the facts are unclear, when the information is ambiguous and people don't know what to do, we go to our fellow professionals of all different stripes and say, look, I need your judgment, perhaps based on your experience, to help me make sense of this uncertainty. So really the question we should be asking isn't, can a machine ever exercise judgment, but it's, can a machine deal with uncertainty better than a human being can? And I put it to you that in many cases, the answer is, of course they can. Now, that's precisely what they're so good at doing. They can handle far larger bodies of data than us and make sense of it in ways that we, acting alone, simply couldn't perceive. So if you go back to that system that I mentioned earlier that tells you whether a freckle is cancerous as accurately as leading dermatologists, how does this actually work? What's it actually doing? Well, it's not trying to copy the judgment of a human doctor. It knows, it understands absolutely nothing about medicine at all. Instead, it's got a database of about 140,000 past cases, and it's running what's essentially a pattern recognition algorithm through those cases, hunting for similarities between all of them and the particular photo of the troubling lesion in question that you've given it. It's performing the task, again, in an unhuman way, based in practice on more possible cases than any human doctor could hope to review in their lifetime. It doesn't matter, and again, this is the key point, it doesn't matter that a human doctor might struggle to tell you exactly how they make a great medical diagnosis. And you'll know this from experience that, you know, if you push a doctor to say, how did you know? How did you make that diagnosis? They might begin by pointing you to the right page of the medical encyclopedia, but eventually they'll start saying things, look, well, I just had a feeling when I went in the room. I just needed to look the patient in the eye. It was based on experience, instinct, intuition. It turns out that the inability of human beings to explain how they do very difficult, subtle, complicated things is far less of a bottleneck on automation than many people thought was possible in the past. We'll take another faculty, creativity. Look, Daniel, you don't understand. What people in the healthcare profession do so often requires creativity. And creativity is the sort of thing a machine can never do. And again, I say the question, can a machine ever exercise creativity? It's the wrong question to be asking. We've got to ask, to what problem do we use creativity to solve? And might we be able to use these technologies to solve that problem, perhaps in very different ways? So what problem do we use creativity to solve? I think it's probably a problem of originality. You know, when we want something novel, when we want something new, when we want, as the great British mathematician Ada Lovelace said, when we want to be taken by surprise, we go to our fellow human beings and say, look, I need you to be creative. I need you to come up with something. So I think the problem we're trying to solve here is one of originality. And I just want you to hold that thought in your mind and consider another system, again owned by DeepMind, this one called AlphaGo. And it plays the board game Go. Now, I don't play Go myself, but what I know about it is that it's combinatorially incredibly complex. And what I mean by that is, if you're playing chess, the number of possible moves that you can make at the start is actually quite well bounded. There's not that many you can make. Whereas in Go, there's 64 possible moves on the first go, 63 on the second, 62 on the third. So the number of possible paths the game can take just explodes incredibly quickly. And that was essentially why most people in AI thought we were about a decade away from building a system that could beat the Garry Kasparov, the world champion of Go. And yet, relatively recently, that is, of course, exactly what AlphaGo did. It sat down with a man called Lee Sedol, who at the time was the world Go champion, and it beat him 4-1. Again, really amazing achievement. But what was particularly interesting about this was a very specific move that the system played. And it was the 37th move in the second game. And again, so I don't play the game Go, but I'm told there is a rule of thumb that anyone who plays the game of Go knows, which says, do not put a piece on the 5th line from the edge. So the board is divided up into 8 horizontal lines, 8 vertical lines, you get 64 intersections, you put pieces on the intersections, and there's a rule of thumb, any beginner knows it, that you don't put a piece on the 5th line from the edge. And yet, in the 37th move in the second game, that's exactly what AlphaGo did. And I should say it went on to win the game. And it was interesting because, I was watching it live on YouTube at the time, and the commentators were speechless. They couldn't explain what had just happened. One former champion called the move beautiful. Another said it brought tears to his eyes. Lee Sedol himself put his head in his hands and had to leave the table shortly after and get a breath of fresh air. Why am I going on about this? Because it was the kind of move that if we saw a human being play, we would have said, gosh, isn't that incredibly creative? It's so original. It's so novel. It's taken everyone by surprise, quite literally. But it just feels wrong to call what that system did in that 37th move in the second game creative. It was solving a problem that we human beings use creativity to solve, namely this problem of originality or novelty. But it was doing it in a fundamentally different way, relying again on processing power, data storage capability, and in particular, in this case, advances in algorithm design. And what's interesting now is that that move has subsequently redefined the way that human beings learn to play the game Go. In fact, Lee Sedol himself has retired from the game in response, saying that slightly morosely, there's nothing left for him in the game. But the point is that it was doing a task that requires creativity from us, but doing it in a fundamentally different way. Can machines think? I love the question from a sort of philosophical point of view, but from a practical point of view, and that's what we should be all thinking about and thinking about the future of healthcare, it's not really the most relevant question. And to see why, I want you to think of another system owned by IBM, this one called Watson. And its claim to fame is that it went on the US quiz show Jeopardy in 2011, and it beat the 2 human champions of the game of Jeopardy. And again, amazing achievement. But what I love about this, looking back on it more than 10 years later, is that the day after Watson won on Jeopardy, the Wall Street Journal ran a terrific piece by the great philosopher John Searle with the title, Watson doesn't know it won on Jeopardy. Right? And it's brilliant. That's completely true, isn't it? Watson didn't let out a cry of excitement. It didn't call up its parents to say what a good job it had done. It didn't want to go down to the proverbial pub for a drink. The system wasn't trying to copy the way that those human contestants thought or the way that they reasoned, but it didn't matter. It still managed to outperform them. It's what I call in my work, to come back to it, an increasingly capable non-thinking machine. And that, I think, is what the second wave of artificial intelligence is all about. And that's what we're in at the moment. Systems and machines that are using remarkable advances, again, in processing power, in data storage capability, and in algorithm design to perform tasks that might require very subtle faculties from us, but perform them in fundamentally different ways. And this, I think, is what's going on with GPT. Indeed, the whole family of generative AI systems that have so captured the popular imagination. These systems don't have minds. They're not conscious. They don't think like us. They don't reason like us. They don't feel like us. And yet, they're able to perform tasks that require those faculties from us, but perform them in fundamentally different ways. And the practical consequence of all of this is, what it means in practice is that a whole realm of activity that in the past, until very recently, we thought was out of reach of these technologies because they required subtle faculties like creativity or judgment, or indeed even empathy. It turns out more and more of those tasks and activities are not out of reach as we originally thought. And it has, I think, really significant implications for thinking about the professions, but thinking about the future of the healthcare profession in particular, because many of these subtler tasks and activities are often to be found in that part of the labor market. So I want to turn now to spend a bit of time thinking about what these technological trends mean for work. I should say that one of the unhelpful things we do when we talk about the future of work is that we tend to talk about the different jobs that people do. So we talk about doctors and nurses and teachers and lawyers and accountants and so on, but actually the term jobs is really unhelpful. And it's unhelpful, to use a phrase that I used before, because it encourages us to think of the work that people do as being a kind of monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff, when actually, and it's an obvious point, but it's an important one, if you look under the bonnet of any job, if you look closely at any job, what you see is that people perform a wide variety of different tasks and different individual activities in their jobs. Now, why does this distinction between thinking top-down in terms of jobs and bottom-up in terms of tasks matter for thinking about the future of work? Well, when we originally published that first book, The Economist wrote a terrific review of it, and alongside it was this cartoon of Professor Dr. Robot QC. The risk when we think about the future of work in terms of entire jobs is that we get trapped in a mindset where the only way that technology can affect the work that people do is by destroying or indeed creating entire jobs in an instant. That one day you'll turn up at work and find Professor Dr. Robot QC or indeed one of their relatives sitting at your desk. Your job will have been taken by a robot. Think how often you hear that phrase in the popular press. But clearly that isn't right. The way, that isn't how technology affects the work that we do. What it does is, in a far more subtle way, it might displace us from performing particular tasks and particular activities, but at the same time, and this is absolutely crucial, it also increases the demand for us to do those unautomated tasks that haven't been automated. And so it's why my view is, in the medium run, and here I have in mind the next 5 to 10 years, the challenge is not one of mass unemployment in the professions, far from it, but it is a challenge of what I call mass redeployment, a really significant change in the sorts of tasks and activities that people will have to do to solve the sorts of problems, again, that have traditionally only been done by very particular types of professionals. Now, I can't go into all of these in detail now, but just let me make 2 observations. The first is that many of these roles are unfamiliar to traditional professionals. Many professionals do not see these things as being part of their job description. The second is that many of these things require skills and capabilities which are quite unlike the sorts of things that we currently train young professionals to do. And I think together, both those observations, begs the question as to whether or not traditional professionals trained in the time-honored way are going to be best placed to do this work in the future. So the challenge, in my view, is fundamentally a skills and a training one, but I'm not sure, as yet, we are set up to respond to it effectively. So let me bring this all down to earth. What should you actually do in response to the ideas that I've shared with you this afternoon? I think sometimes I get the sense that people just want to hold out until retirement before any of this stuff engulfs them. I'd say that is not a good strategy. Pretend it's not happening is another one. Or more seriously, build barriers to protect traditional ways of working. And I'll say more on this in a moment, but what's really interesting about the professions, and the healthcare profession is really included in this, is that professionals get a very strong sense of identity and purpose, not only from the problems that they solve, but also the way in which they traditionally solve them. Doctors not only like solving medical problems, but they like the white gowns and the stethoscopes. Teachers not only like educating students, but they like the chalkboards and the traditional classroom setup. And as a result, there is in the professions, and I think in the healthcare profession in particular, a very strong instinct to want to protect traditional ways of working. And I think that is a mistake. So here are 3 tasks that I think we could usefully do for thinking about the future of the healthcare profession. And the first is explore those new roles that I set out before. As I said, many of the roles are unfamiliar to traditional professionals. Many of them require very different types of skills and capabilities. Together, both those things beg the question as to whether or not traditional professionals trained in the time-honored way are going to be best placed to do that work in the future. Very crudely, if you were to ask me, what skills, what capabilities, I think there are 2 paths here. Either we ought to be training people to compete with these systems and machines, to do the sorts of things that these systems and machines cannot yet do. And in spite of everything I've said this afternoon, clearly there are large areas of human activity that lie beyond the reach of even the most capable technologies. certain types of communication and interpersonal tasks still, certain tasks that require things like creativity and judgment and empathy and things like that, even still, in spite of everything I've said. The second strategy, though, is quite different. And instead, here we train people to build these systems and machines, to be capable of designing and operating and putting these technologies to use and understanding how they work as well. Now, that distinction might sound relatively anodyne, relatively straightforward, but I put it to you that if you look at what we actually do in practice, often it's neither of those things. Often we are training people to do precisely the kind of routine activities that these technologies are already very good at doing, and I think that is a tremendous mistake. So that's the first task, to explore the new roles that I set out before and the skills required to do them. For the second task, I want you to think about a story about Black & Decker, the world's leading manufacturer of power tools. And it said at Black & Decker, they take their new executives on a course, and they confront them all with a slide like this, of a gleaming power drill. This is what we sell, isn't it? The trainers ask of the assembled new executives. And the new executives seem rather surprised by this question, but they then sort of collectively gather some confidence to reply that, yes, this is of course what we sell. We're Black & Decker, the world's leading manufacturer of power tools. And then with some satisfaction, the trainers respond, well, no, that isn't actually what you sell, because this is not actually what your customers want. This is what your customers want. And your job is to find ever more creative, imaginative, competitive ways of giving your customers exactly what they want. And I think there is a powerful lesson here for thinking about the future of the healthcare profession too. All too often, when healthcare professionals look to the future, they're of that sort of power drill mentality. They ask, what do we do today, face-to-face, one-to-one interaction with a human professional, and they ask how we can improve that. But I think not often enough do leaders ask the more fundamental question, which is, what do patients really want from us? Some might be happy with the power drill, the traditional way of working, but I think there are many, many others that will want what the NHS is supposed to provide, or the healthcare profession in general is supposed to provide, namely well-being, but perhaps packaged in a very different way. So I think the second task for you is to focus in our thinking about the future not on the inherited process, this sort of power drill mentality, this traditional way of thinking about things, but to focus relentlessly on the outcomes we're trying to achieve, the hole in the wall, or in the healthcare profession's case, well-being. And I think to be open to achieving that outcome, perhaps in radically different ways through technology in the future than in the past. Because that, in the end, is what technology is doing. And I think it's quite a useful way to think about technology, that it's providing us with very different ways of solving long-standing problems. A third task, and I want to finish on this, is, again, a point about mindset. And it's how to think about the future. I think, again, the temptation when thinking about the future is to go right back to the start, to be of that kind of first future mindset. Again, the sort of power drill mindset. How can I take what I've always done and just do it a bit more efficiently and more effectively? And I think that is really to miss out on the promise of what's currently taking place. I think a far more useful exercise is to quite literally start with a blank sheet of paper. Forget the particular institutions that you're part of, forget the particular roles that you have, and instead ask, given the technological possibilities that are out there and that are emerging, how might I go about solving the problems that I'm meant to be solving, perhaps in fundamentally different ways? And in other words, to be of that second future mindset rather than the first. So I will finish there. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. I look forward now to hearing some reflections and taking some questions as well. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. We have got time for questions. Just to remind everyone, we do have Slido in the Confed app, but we also have roving mics as well. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. I can see hands going up already. I'm actually still stuck on the Confessions app, to be honest. I'm just thinking, You know,
tend to be. I wonder why.
Well, you know, I'm just thinking, given my phone knows my location, my photos, my payments, and let's face it, my browser history, if I can have some kind of closed loop, confessional kind of system just working in the background.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can just go about my job.
Cleansing your system.
Cleansing me automatically. So before we all rush off to update our CVs, let's ask some questions.
Yep.
And got some hands. Brilliant. I'll come to you in a second. I am going to use chair's prerogative and just ask one question first, if I may, Daniel. In the NHS, we do like to talk about risk.
Yes.
Now, you've not talked a lot about risk. I just wondered if you could just give us some reflections on, given the future that you've described.
Yes.
And this isn't healthcare sector specific. You know, what are the potential risks of this future that is definitely coming our way?
Yes.
And I think a lot about the fact that, you know, especially in my world around technology and innovation, we talk about the inherent bias
Yes.
that sometimes is built into AI
Yes.
thinking. So just a few reflections on risk would be really useful.
I mean, I will say as a sort of a kind of mindset, I think it's certainly true that, and it's not just in the healthcare profession, it's across the professions. If I were talking to a group of lawyers or a group of accountants or whoever it might be, there is immediately that concern with risk. And I just think in terms of, it's just an observation that we need to balance our reflections on risk. And I think there are, you know, really important risks that we need to think about, but we need to balance that concern with risk with also the opportunities that these technologies present to. And we've got to think very clearly about what sort of benchmarks we're using to judge these technologies. Are we using perfection, which is a higher standard than we hold our fellow human beings, or are we using another type of standard altogether? You mentioned sort of bias, and I think that's really interesting. So I'll maybe just say a little on that, because I think it's absolutely true that one of the most significant risks with these technologies is the bias inherent in them. You know, one of the great merits of those systems that I was mentioning back in the 1980s is that they are very, very transparent. You know, if you wanted to understand how one of those systems reached a particular diagnosis, it was very easy to do so because it was based on human reasoning, and you could follow through and see, you know, why a particular medical diagnosis was given, say. With these new systems, they're far more opaque. It's far harder to understand how they reach a particular decision. And more than that, the way the systems work is that they're trained, as I'm sure you all know, on vast bodies of data, often data generated from human experience. And so what happens as a consequence is that if there's any bias in that data, it gets perhaps exaggerated in that decisions, recommendations, actions of these technologies. And again, it's not just the healthcare profession that you see it, you know, whether these systems are used to decide who gets a job offer, whether the systems are used to decide who gets parole. You see kind of biases emerging. The one, and you know, this is now a big field. You know, the field of algorithmic bias is a sort of thriving area of research. The one comment I would make about that particular risk, though, is that I think what's really interesting about these technologies is that often, because they're trained on human data, when they exhibit biases, often they are simply reflecting the biases that exist in our own human decision-making. Often what they're doing is holding a mirror up to ourselves, revealing biases that either we knew were there or didn't know were there. And it's just, it's quite interesting just reflection to keep in mind that when these systems exhibit biases, very often it's not the system itself being biased, it's the fact it's been trained on data generated by human beings with all our flaws and imperfections and biases too.
Interesting. Thank you. Got some Slido comments that we're going to come to, but I know there's some very keen people, particularly, well, I've got a gentleman here in the blue shirt and a lady at the top there, just at the back. So let's start here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely riveting. My question is really about how we, as the leaders of several groups of professions in the organisations we work in, support them and help to manage the transition. I was particularly struck by your phrase decomposition of tasks, and just looking at the professional distress and debate that is going on around physician associates as an example of decomposition by another group of human beings. When this starts to bite as a concerted attack on the current professional set up by an army of different AIs,
Yes.
how the professions will respond to that and how we manage that transition.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I don't shy away from that. I should say that one of the, when we talk about AI today in 2024, it is interesting how we often ask what it means for traditional providers, what it means for doctors, nurses, teachers, accountants, architects, whoever it might be. That's what conversations about the future of work tend to focus on. The thing that really got us interested in this, and it's the thing that motivated my dad's entire career in thinking about AI and law, was actually not what it meant for providers and what it meant for consumers of these professional services. In his case, it was the feeling that not enough people had access to, didn't have access to legal expertise, didn't know how to manage their rights. But it's a general problem, which is that not enough people have access to a good education. They don't have access to a good enough healthcare system. They don't have access to knowledge of how to manage their financial affairs. That was a sort of motivation that got us interested in the first place. It's got me interested, a feeling that the traditional professions, as I said at the start, not just the healthcare profession, but across the board, a sense that they were creaking, and that there was an opportunity here to use technology to make that sort of access to that expertise more widely available than before. Now, why does this matter? Because I think the most important, and this is challenging and difficult, but I think it's just true, that the purpose of the healthcare profession is not to provide a living for traditional doctors and traditional nurses. The purpose of law is not to provide a living for traditional lawyers. That's my starting point. It's to provide access to good healthcare. It's to provide access to, legal expertise and resolving legal disputes and so on. And so what we need to do is focus on that outcome and just remind the professions that the purpose of the professions is to achieve these incredibly important outcomes in society. The professions are responsible for some of the most important outcomes in society, but at the same time also help those traditional professionals, and as I said before, help those traditional professionals learn the skills and capabilities to do the sorts of new roles and new activities that are going to be in demand in the future. It's not a story, I think, of mass unemployment, as I said, but it's a story of really quite significant redeployment, and that, I think, is really difficult. So, I think if professionals are focused on another way to put it, if professionals are focused on the outcomes that they're trying to achieve and less focused on the traditional ways of solving those outcomes, then I think that is how we move forward in transforming the professions. It's a challenge that starts right at the beginning, though, when people go into the professions. If you go into medicine because you want to be the sort of doctor that you saw on House, or you go into law because you want to be the sort of lawyer that you saw on Suits, the sort of professional that our grandparents were or our parents were, then I think it's going to be a disappointing and difficult few decades, because the way in which we solve these problems in the professions is just going to transform really quite dramatically.
Daniel, is there something to say for the fact that the coming disruption to the professional classes in a number of sectors is akin to what we've seen over the last decades in terms of more manual labour? I mean, I come from a family of miners.
Yeah.
We have moved from, the 20s, my relatives being on their backs with pickaxes, to one man pressing a button on a big drill.
Yeah.
Is it this case that the professions have almost been insulated from that, but there is a similar kind of revolution coming?
I think that that's one way to think about it. Just to sort of stylize the story, that in the 20th century, the story of automation was largely a sort of blue-collar story. It was a story in the UK from the 1950s onwards. It was unfolding in manufacturing, but in the century before that, it was unfolding in agriculture. Mm. And one of the really interesting things about these new technologies is that, and this is the point I was really trying to get across today, is that some of the things that they are able to do are some of the things that demand or require some of the most subtle, complex faculties from us: creativity, judgment, even empathy. There's a paradox in computer science, which is known as Moravec's paradox, after the science fiction writer called Hans Moravec, who was the first to note it. And he said, many of the things that are easiest to do with our hands are now hardest to automate, whereas conversely, many of the things that are hardest to do with our heads are easiest to automate. It's just a sort of interesting paradox of some of the technologies of the moment, that the level of sort of formal education or professional training that you need to do a particular task turns out to be far less of a useful signal of whether or not that task can be automated. So I think that's a fair observation.
Let's get a couple more quick questions in. So, oh my words, you're not allowed to all put your hand up now. There were a few very patient people on the back, so let's go there.
Hi there. Hi. Great talk, thank you. So, of course, one of the big debates in some quarters is about how things like DALI, GPT, etc., are trained on data from the internet, so people's work that may be copyrighted. I was wondering what your opinion is on the, not the legal side of that, but the ethical side of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and it is a live debate at the moment. The question from a sort of narrow legal point of view is, when these systems rely on this data, are they simply copying what they find, which is legally objectionable, or are they learning from what they find? And you know, we as human beings learn all the time from copyrighted material without worrying about breach of copyright, whether it's a book we read and are inspired by, whether it's a painting in an art gallery that we see and it moves us and causes us to think of it. So so it's a sort of legal wrangle at the moment. My own personal view on this is that we ought to think of these technologies as being, my own personal view on it is that we have it the wrong way around. At the moment, there are moves to try and prevent people from using material on the way in, and then not allow copyright for the material that these systems generate. So if you generate a wonderful image, at the moment you're not allowed to copyright it, because in many jurisdictions, copyright requires some kind of significant human kind of agency, creativity, and they say, no, the creativity was done by the system, and so you can't copyright. I think that's completely the wrong way around. I think we should be from the starting point that we want to allow as much use and reuse of existing material, learning from the material, not copying it. And if there are examples of just flat copying, and there are some examples out there, that ought to be impermissible. But I also think that we ought to be offering copyright protection for the creations that come out the other end. If anyone has played around with these systems, they'll know that there is a lot of skill involved in coming up with a good prompt for GPT, for DALI, for Sora, whatever it might be. And that's the kind of, and there is now online a marketplace of prompts where you can go and buy prompts developed. Here's a new jobber, by prompt maximizers, people who are very good at articulating exactly what they want these systems to do. We ought to be, in my view, protecting that sort of creativity, offering protection at the other end, and trying to relax protection on the way in. That's my view, and to the extent that it's undetermined at the moment and there's legal wrangling, we ought to be pushing for an interpretation of these systems as systems that learn rather than systems that copy.
Thank you. We'll have one more from the floor, but before we do, clearly we've got a lot of parents with kids doing GCSEs right now because of the nature of the questions, but what area of work would you recommend to 15-year-olds?
Yeah. I mean, it really depends what they want to do. I'd say again that, so say a 15-year-old wants to go into the professions. I think one of the perhaps counterintuitive observations I'd make is that, if you want to go into the healthcare profession, the best thing you ought to do is train to be a traditional professional. Take the traditional route. And the reason I say that is because some of you might have noticed in almost every example I mentioned, what you see is, every example of an interesting technology at the vanguard is you see both a technical expert, so somebody who knows a lot about the technologies, but you also see a domain expert, someone who knows a lot about the medical profession, the legal profession, or the law, or kind of medical knowledge, or whatever it might be. It's a combination of both. And the best way to still learn the domain, learn medicine, learn law, learn accountancy, and so on, is still to take the traditional route. But then so that would be my advice, is that actually if you're interested in going into professions, still take the traditional route, but, and this is the big but, be far more open-minded and agnostic about what you might do having gone through that route.
Last quick question. Who's got the mic? Apologies we couldn't get many in. Buy Daniel's book, though, if you want to know the answers to the questions you're going to.
Thank you for the presentation. Really, really fascinating. I think you touched on it briefly earlier, just in terms of there's been a degree of overexcitement in AI. AI has become an incredibly powerful marketing tool. This might be difficult to answer in a simple way, but for the NHS and those exploring partnerships or making decisions about investment in AI, what's the top 3 questions they should be asking of prospective partners and suppliers to sort the wheat from the chaff?
Such a good question. So I completely agree. I think I was sort of, when someone offered to buy me a artificially intelligent toothbrush for Christmas, that was a sense that things were sort of rising to a bit of a peak. I think there's actually one question that matters more than anything, and it's just outcomes. Show me that this particular technology delivers an outcome which is better than the alternative in whatever particular setting it might be. Just to be sort of ruthlessly focused on outcomes. And if that's kind of hopefully one of the themes of what I've been saying today, that we ought to, in thinking about the future of the professions, focus far more on the outcomes we're trying to achieve and be far more agnostic about how we go about doing that. And if someone cannot demonstrate that a particular technology improves the particular outcome that you're trying to achieve, then that's a reason to steer clear.
Thank you so much. We are unfortunately out of time. I hope you've really enjoyed that session. Can I ask you to thank Daniel in the usual way?